going to be talking about a few things. As I was reading Noe's book, I was talking to him about some of the things, and I found out many of the things happened in April. And here we are in April. And so this, I thought, it's very unusual. I asked Noe, did you put these events in chronological order in your chapters? And as I looked, they weren't in order. So I started writing down when these sightings happened, and so I decided to kind of change my what I was talking about a little bit today. Because last time we talked about cowboys and aliens. Well, this is not so much cowboys and aliens, but city dwellers and aliens and UFOs. So I decided to change my talk a little bit. Now, last time I was here at the library, I did stories for kids, and so I did all this preparation and everything, and then when it came time to tell the stories, there were only 6 kids there. So well, I got all worked up and nervous about, for no reason. So tried to not to get too nervous today about stuff.
Here's your friend.
Yeah, all right. So I hope I'm a little more attractive than this guy. And we'll talk about him today because this is typically what a lot of people nowadays, when they see, humanoid, they kind of describe them in this way. But these people from back in the 1890s, they don't really describe them like this at all. It's very interesting how they described the people that did see passengers on these ships, how they described them. And they describe them in many different ways, but this is not a common way or description of what they saw. So I'm going to kind of start, first before I start though, because we're talking about the MUFON website going online and the one in the Valley, and I was trying to do some research, and I found out that the government, they're kind of, what could I say, copying what MUFON has been doing, and that federal government has actually come out and they have their own website now where people can report, they can go in and report and post pictures of things they've seen onto this website. And if you have a pen, you can write this down, or maybe you can put it on your phone. The website is aaro.mil, and I'm guessing that's for military, MIL. And the name of the website, if you go to their front page, this is the first time I've looked at it on my phone, but I have been looking at it on the computer. It's called the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. And they explain, our team of experts is leading the U.S. government's efforts to address UAPs using a rigorous scientific framework and data-driven approach. Sounds like MUFON to me. Since its establishment in July of 2022, AARO has taken important steps to improve the data collection, standardize reporting requirements, and mitigate the potential threats to safety and security posed by a UAP. We look forward to using this site to regularly update the public about AARO's work and its findings, and to provide a mechanism for UAP reporting. Thank you for visiting our website. And then it has different links you can go on. So I did a little bit of clicking and looking at their links, and they have a lot of stuff for NASA and space flights. And you can click on all these different, they have documents and things from all the space programs since back in the 60s. And then they also have military links you can click on, and they have photos from back, World War I all the way up to Korea and Afghanistan and things. So most of the pictures I clicked on were all military things. The only pictures I saw of UFOs, they had 7 pictures of the same UFO. So taking it in a different time frame. That's all. But anything else I clicked on that had to do with UAPs, it'll say, photo not available yet, video not available yet. So maybe they have them, but they haven't posted them. So they have an area where we as the public can go on and report stuff and download, send pictures to them, and apparently they're going to try to start photographing them. And I don't know if that's from, we were just talking about the gentleman that was coming out telling the public, or the government, they need to be more open about this to the public. So I guess this is kind of their response, is they created this web page and they've organized it so you can do some searching and you can do some self-reporting. So again, like I said, they're kind of copying what MUFON's already been doing and putting it on a government level, and maybe starting to release stuff to the public that they've kept secret. Now, you know, how much of that they're going to release, we'll see. Now, what I wanted to start talking about today is coming from Noe's book, Lost UFO Cases of the Old West. And many of the cases, some of them you could go online and do some research yourself. These are all cases that were reported in local newspapers. So in the book it tells of which paper the article was published in and the date. And most of them, the newspapers went out and interviewed people. And so you also have the names of people that they interviewed and their descriptions of what they saw. So this was very important. It's kind of like a MUFON thing. The newspapers reporting what they saw, when they saw it, what direction it came from, what happened, and they talked to many of the witnesses. Now, this is about the mass in that, starting in late 1896 and going on to about June of 1897, all over the United States, there were mass sightings of UFOs. And when I say mass sightings, they're talking about hundreds to thousands of people saw the same thing at the same time. So it was a mass sighting. And most of them happened in the Midwest. And many of them, which I found many of them in Noe's book, happened in April of 1897. Okay? And what were these things that these people were seeing? So I did, not a lot of research, but did a little bit of research and found out that a Frenchman named Henry Gifford, in 1852, he flew the first hydrogen-powered balloon. So this was back in the middle of the 1800s. They had, before that, people had flown hot air balloons, but this was a sealed gas balloon, and so they had flown it. And then others started flying these balloons, and one guy tried to fly across the English Channel and started sinking down before he got to England. So he's throwing everything he could out of the carriage underneath it to make sure he could get to England. But in 1895 was when Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin and David Schwartz made the first Zeppelin airship. They called them airships in those days. So the Zeppelin was made a year before these sightings that we're going to talk about. So, there weren't really a lot of these blimps and balloons flying around at that time. And then it wasn't until 1925 that the Goodyear blimp first appeared. So Goodyear had their blimp, and the first flight of the Goodyear blimp was in 1925. So that was about 100 years ago. And in 1937, of course, the Hindenburg disaster, the big disaster when that Zeppelin hit some high wires and exploded, and all those people were jumping out of the carriage and everything. So, and it was on film, so that's a famous or infamous thing that occurred with these flying airships. So, since Zeppelin didn't invent his until 1895, these sightings in 1896 and 1897, well, how many people went out and built airships a year after this guy just invented them? So a lot of these sightings, what were they exactly that they were seeing? And it's interesting because a lot of the witnesses, they talk that about people that came down there, they shouted up, they were speaking English. But many of the other sightings, they couldn't understand what kind of gibberish that people were talking or speaking. So it's kind of interesting. So we'll start out in 1896. Now the first really reported and recorded by the newspaper sighting happened in San Francisco, or Sacramento, I think it was. And it was in November of 1896. So this is kind of the beginning of when people in the United States started seeing these mass sightings. Now, I don't know if there were mass sightings in other parts of the world, Mexico or whatever, but these were all recorded by U.S. newspapers. And so Noe was able to get the accounts of these newspapers and describe what some of the witnesses saw. So in his book, I'm going to go over a couple that weren't in his book, but most of the ones I'm going to talk about came from chapters in his book, and we're not going to go over all of them. The ones I'm going to talk about happened in this short time period from November up to about May and June of 1897. Now, this first one, the San Francisco newspaper reported that the most obvious feature of this was an electrical light. It said it was not, they didn't know how this light was attached to the structure of what they were seeing, but since it moved around, they figured it wasn't just a light moving around, it had to have been attached some which way. And what a lot of witnesses described, it was an egg-shaped craft with 4 downward-facing propellers. And I started thinking about that, and Noe and I, we were carrying some equipment out to one of the buildings at Mac High we were disposing of, and we went in where the tech kids are working, and they were building a drone probably about half the size of one of these rectangular tables, a pretty big drone. They had 4 propellers. So I thought, wow, what we see a lot flying around now with cameras attached to them and stuff, sounded like a lot of what these guys were describing back in the 1800s. All right, so we started talking about how this mass sighting started happening at the end of 1896. Now the the San Francisco Call, that was the name of the newspaper, San Francisco Call, they actually talked to some witnesses and had their artist draw a picture of what it was, and they had it published in the paper. So you could actually go to this newspaper. Now, some of these newspapers, if they're not around anymore, but with our modern ability, a lot of the newspapers today are going back and archiving all their old ones and putting them online so that you can actually start searching through a lot of the old editions of newspapers to find out what was going on. But they drew their own picture of it depending on the descriptions of the witnesses. Now, it said that they flew over the city for about a half an hour and changed courses many times. And so the people were amazed that something this big was so maneuverable, and it said it could even go against, it was driving against the wind or flying against the wind. And of course, they always describe them as ships. They call them as airships because they said that they went up and down and back and forth kind of like a ship on the waves. And so you would think, well, maybe these are lighter than air aircraft if they're being bobbed around by the wind. But they were amazed that these things could go against the wind in whatever direction. And so they watched them for about a half an hour or so until it disappeared. Well, the next night, the object appeared again, except it came from the different direction. So it's like it went out and disappeared into the ocean. Then the next night, they saw it coming back. So wherever it went, it was coming back, and they watched it doing the same type of maneuvers, except in the opposite direction. And so it said other papers in California kind of ignored it, but many of them, because so many people saw it, took it seriously. And then on the 22nd, that the object showed up again, but this time it had 2 lights on it, not just 1, but 2. And they weren't just lights that they were in the air, but they were shining down like spotlights onto the ground. So sometimes they see these objects flying in the air and they just see the lights in the air. Others describe that they have searchlights where they could shine them all the way down onto the ground. Okay, so it was reported by various newspapers in California that in the following days of that, these things were sighted from San Diego all the way up into British Columbia along the west coast of the United States. So that, when I was looking at that, this was the only one that really happened out in the far west. Most of the ones we're going to talk about that happened after that happened more in the Midwest, and one in Texas. So that was the beginning. The first time that the newspaper had reported that mass sightings was in November of 1896. Now, going into Noe's book, he has many chapters there, but I took the ones that happened at this time period, and I put them kind of in chronological order. And so in Noe's book, there's 14 chapters in his book, and it describes 13 sightings, mass sightings, that happened within 12 days of each other. So in less than 2 weeks, there were 13 different sightings, mass sightings, where hundreds of people saw these objects flying in the sky in a short 2-week time period. And these all, the ones I wrote down to talk about, all happened in April. It started on April 11th, and the last sighting was in April 23rd. And it's very interesting. I'm going to read a few things from his book as we get to them. Now, the first one was happened in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in April the 11th of 1897. So these are all in April of 1897. And this is found in chapter 32 of his book. And this was cited by, the story was written about in the Chicago Tribune. And it says that this object was seen by thousands of people, and one of the persons they interviewed was a policeman. He was a station keeper named Harry Moore from the Central Police Station. And so they said, if you can't trust him to tell the truth, who can you trust? He's a police captain. And this is his description. It says, the machine, or whatever it was anchored and stopped directly over the city hall. And a light I saw was suspended from a large, dark, oval-shaped object, the shadow of which could be distinctly seen. So the light was shining so bright, but you could see behind the light a dark object, since it was at night, but you could see the shape of it. It says, it was seen so plainly I could discern that there were wheels working. I did not see anyone in it, but anyone who claims that the thing I saw floating over the city was a star simply don't know what he's talking about. I saw it too distinctly to be fooled. It was, and I should judge, about 1,000 feet above the city hall. So this is the captain of the police force there, and he says anybody that thinks I'm lying is a fool. So he describes what he saw, but thousands of people in the Chicago area, well, this was in Milwaukee, which is near Chicago, saw this on that particular night. And they just happened to interview him in the Chicago Tribune. Now, the next one, in April the 12th, there were sightings in 2 different states. One was in Maysville, Missouri, and one was in Pavilion, Michigan. It happened on April the 12th. Now, Missouri and Michigan aren't that close together, so who knows if it's the same airship they saw or not. Now, this one's particularly interesting because the people described, and one guy goes into detail, but this is in a later time, but the people described it as looking, the aliens that they saw looked Nordic. They looked like Scandinavians. And they said that the people that they saw, that they witnessed, they thought they were talking Danish because they were trying to talk to them, and the people, the humanoids talked back to them, but they couldn't understand what they were saying. They said they thought they were talking Danish since they looked Scandinavian. Now what's interesting in this, let's see, this one's in chapter, that's chapter 22, let me look. Yeah. They talked about them as Nordics, and this guy in 1965, who claimed to have been abducted by some aliens, he described them as Nordic. And his description is so interesting. And again, this was in 1953? That was the year I was born. This guy, George Adamski, he claims to have been abducted. And he talks about these Nordics as being so beautiful, their skin so soft like babies, and that looked like they never had a whisker on their face. It looked like they had a baby face and never shaved at all. And their beautiful long hair was so soft and beautiful that women of the day would be so jealous to have hair like these people. And he described them, he thought they were all men that he saw. He didn't describe them as being women. And he described them about being about 5.5 feet tall. Now these Nordics that were seen in the 1800s, they described them as being about 9 feet tall. So it's kind of interesting, the difference there. And this guy was so taken by them, he said just looking at them, you felt so comfortable and at ease because they were such beautiful beings. So their hair was sandy color and hung in beautiful waves to his shoulders, glistening more beautiful than any woman's hair I have ever seen. And I remember passing a thought of how Earth women would enjoy having such beautiful hair as these men do. And as I said before, he wore no protection over it, and it was being blown by the wind. His clothing was a one-piece garment, which I had a feeling was a uniform, one worn by spacemen as they traveled. Like Earthmen in various work occupations wear uniforms today. Okay, so this was published in the St. Joseph, Missouri Herald magazine. And the ones that had seen it earlier said these humanoids exited the ship and were very annoyed because they were arguing with each other with such earnestness and I can't say the word, vehement. Whatever. They were arguing with each other. And they tried to contact them, but they said the men looked at them very sternly. They didn't want to talk to the Earthlings. And I guess they were kind of upset, I guess, like when you get a flat tire on your car and you go, man, you got to get out and change the tire. Well, something happened to their ship, and they landed and they got out and started banging on the ship for about a half an hour. Then they got back on the ship and took off. He said, the navigator seemed to be utterly disgusted with having to alight and was not in a conversational mood, and nothing was learned from him as we tried to talk to him. So in 30 minutes, everything was repaired, and they got in their ship and was gone, and they were gone. And so many people, I don't know how many hundreds of people that had, when they found out these guys had landed, had run to see the ship that had landed. And again, they said they thought they were speaking in Danish. So this one describes the aliens not quite so unattractive as Cosmo here. And the guy was just taken by him. He couldn't keep his eyes off these the guy later who went and talked. Now the next one happened a day later in Indiana. So they go from Michigan to Indiana. And this was in April the 13th. And this one is in chapter 24. So that's the next chapter. And again, this was in the Chicago Chronicle newspaper. The newspaper published the article 2 days after the sightings. And this one also described the ship as having wings, kind of like you'd describe a modern newspaper, and with these bright spotlights that shone down from the ship. So this was just a day later. Now on April 15th, 2 cities in Michigan reported sightings. And so this was just 2 days after the sightings in Indiana. This was some more sightings in Michigan. So they went from Michigan to Indiana, back to Michigan. This was in Battle Creek, Michigan, and Haslett, Michigan. And this was published in the Lansing Star Republic and the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania Press. And again, this one, they talked to one of the witnesses, and he went over to a window and tried to look into the window and was blinded by a bright light. He said there was a voice coming from the spaceship. He was asleep when this was awoken by those lights. He went out, and the voice spoke, explaining that they, whoever they were hovering in a ship and were about to process repairing damage to one of the wings. So they came down and landed, and again these aliens went out and did some repair work on their ship and then took off. He said he asked if he could come to before they took off, he asked if he could come and look inside the ship, and he said they laughed at him and answered no. So he said what sounded like laughter and told them no, you can't come on board the ship. So and he didn't really, this one guy, he didn't really describe what they looked like. He did hear them talking. Okay. Now the next one happens a day later in Iowa and again in Michigan. And this one's fun. These two are fun because the one that landed in Iowa, a giant 10-foot tall naked alien came out. And they call it the naked giant. And so some of the people came up and they saw the giant, and they began, people from the town began to come because they all wanted to see this giant because the word spread like wildfire. Well, one guy came up and wanted to talk to the giant, and he got too close, and the giant pushed him away with his foot. So then I said another guy who was even braver came but said he was too brave because the giant gave him a swift kick. He went flying and he ended up in the hospital with a broken hip. Now it doesn't say as far as I remember, it doesn't say how the giant disappeared back into a spaceship. But in the same day in Michigan, this is chapter 26. Let me see if I can find it. The guy saw a UFO, and the description, well, this one describes the giant, the naked giant. It said after they described about him kicking them in there, I guess everybody ran then because it says there's no further mention of him anywhere in a historical record other than this newspaper article. Now on the same day in Pavilion, Michigan, an airship, it said it exploded and pieces were raining down, and so they had to land and repair their spaceship. Again, these guys were landing like, what's happening to these guys' spaceships if they're all exploding? But these guys saw the aliens that came out to repair their ship, and they didn't look anything like the naked giant. They said these guys had the longest whiskers they had ever seen. They were aliens with long, pointy beards down to the ground. So I pictured them as looking like Gandalf or something in the Lord of the Rings. And a lot of these space movies, you always see guys wearing cloaks. I'm like, what's with the cloaks? Nobody describes aliens as wearing a cloak, but they all look like they, wearing times from the ancient times or something. So here's 2 different sightings the same day. One was a giant naked humanoid, and the other were bearded aliens. Now on the 19th of April, which was 3 days later, now we have a sighting in Texas, Beaumont, Texas, and then there was also a sighting the same day in Lake Charles, Louisiana. Now, whether these were the same, was the same craft they saw or two different crafts, not sure. This one happened, let me go to the Louisiana one. It's chapter 38. Where's that 30? Can't read my own handwriting. Okay. Oh, this one was reported by the Dallas Morning News. So this was the one, it happened in Lake Charles, Louisiana, but it was reported by the Dallas News. And this one was also described as kind of like a blimp. You know, they always describe them as these cigar-like things with carriage underneath them. And like we talked about before, this was in 1897. Well, these blimps, the Zeppelins and that, weren't invented to 1895, 2 years before. So were there a bunch of blimp-making companies in the United States making blimps and people flying around? You know, so what they were describing, you know, from the way they describe it, talks about these blimp kind of things. But how many people in the United States, especially in the podunk down in Texas somewhere, had seen blimps flying around before? You know, it's hard to say. But these guys say the ship landed and they actually went on board the ship. And they said they met the crew, and the crew had names. They were Mr. Wilson, Mr. Warren, and Mr. Waters. WWW. And they said they think one of the crew members was from Mexico. Well, that doesn't sound like a very Hispanic name, Waters. But the crew told them that they had been conducting experiments with gas, and that they used wheels of some kind to get up to 65,000 RPMs, that they could fly over 125 miles an hour. This is what they told them. So whether, you know, it doesn't say whether this was an actual Zeppelin. I mean, if the guys had, you know, names and led them on board the ship and were talking to them, you know, it must have been. But it said similar incident happened in Stephenville, Texas, the same day, the day before, and in April 20th in New Orleans. And they were both reported by different newspapers. So maybe this one might have actually been a Zeppelin of some kind, if they were allowed to go on the ship and the people could speak English and had names. So this one might have been an actual a Zeppelin plane. Now, 2 days later, this one happened. We have several. The next two happened in Arkansas and Texas on April 21st, April 22nd, and April 23rd. And the one that happened on April 23rd is interesting. Let me go to the chapter. Well, they're all interesting. But this one is interesting because the people, this was reported in the Chicago Tribune. No, that's a different one. I'm in the wrong chapter. Okay.
Steve, while you're looking at it, I just want to add that it wasn't until after 1901, 1902 time frame that Zeppelin started being developed. So this was, unless there was something experimental being done by some strange, closeted inventor somewhere, these were not man-made craft. Now, what John LeMay and I, who wrote this book together, think might be happening is that the UFOs tried to disguise themselves to look somewhat like the craft of their time. Like, so at that time, there were blimps, but these had capabilities. People saw them zooming across the sky at great distances. They saw these massive lights that would illuminate the whole ground below. These were not man-made craft. They appeared to be. They gave the general impression of being maybe blimp-like. but they were definitely not man-made. There's no active inventors at the time that were piloting craft like what are in our book. So
Right, like I said, that the Zeppelin didn't invent the Zeppelin until 1895, which is just a year, like a year and a half before these sightings. So
But what
how
was-
could people describe
right,
them?
but even then, inventing a prototype
Yeah.
and actually having it go into the air, that didn't occur until years later.
Yeah, the blimp,
So-
the Goodyear blimp didn't even start until 1925, which was 30 years after these
Right.
things occurred. This was the only instance that I saw in the book where the people spoke English. Most of the time, one, they said the guy bellowed like he was some kind of animal when he tried to talk to him. Now this one's interesting because they describe, this one happened around Texarkana.
One
and they
quick
just-
additional point, Steve. Later on in history, when the U.S. had developed airplanes made of metal, and jet planes were being developed in the late 40s, early 50s, then we started to see metal UFOs that looked somewhat like man-made jets, although they were circular or in other odd shapes. But once again, you have these UFO occupants trying to disguise their craft to be more like what man-made craft is a theory that we feel. And now things have changed in our area. In our era, in our time period now, we see triangles, we see different shapes which are sort of like some of our stealth aircraft. So, once again, the thinking is that these guys are trying to disguise their craft to look more or less in a general conceptual framework like man-made craft.
Right, and a lot of these are all described as being cigar-shaped. That's the most common. It wasn't until much later, when we saw the video where Kenneth Arnold described saucers.
Correct.
And so and he didn't say a flying saucer, like they said. It looked like a saucer skipping over, like it skim a stone across water.
So, I have a question.
Yes.
On what you were mentioning. If they're trying to project, like what the times is it like a projection screen? I mean, because it would seem like a...
No, I think the actual craft is made that way. Although they also use some kind of light shifting invisibility screens now that make them more or less invisible or change their shape or make them appear to be
The appearance, right?
within clouds. It looks like a cloud, but within that cloud is the craft. So
Because it
they have
would be
other...
a lot of work to change, a lot of work to go to make their ship look like a airplane.
Right.
Like to build something that takes time,
We don't see, nowadays in modern UFO reports, we don't see blimp-like UFOs too often. We see them every now and then, but mostly we see triangles, saucers, delta wing type vehicles.
Because I've seen photos of balloons that are so advanced now that they make them look like a UFO, like a saucer.
Yeah.
And when you look at it from a distance, without the flame, it looks like very real-like, but they happen to be balloons, man-made balloons.
Well, NASA has some prototypes that look a lot like the Zeppelins of the early 1900s, so it's interesting. We've gone back and now they're finding these new ways to make them go aloft to where it's not dangerous, like where they'll explode like the Hindenburg. They have new gas mixtures and stuff. So now they're becoming feasible again as air vehicles.
You also mentioned the appearance of some of the aliens, and I remember a couple of years ago with Mike Barn.
Yeah.
He was asked a question because they were talking about the Pleiades, and they were talking about how Hitler, when they were communicating or describing the aliens, the technology they're trying to get, they had to be this tall, blonde guys and stuff like that. But he also mentioned that was like basically made up because Hitler at that time wanted to be the superior race in time, so he made these aliens look like what he wanted to personify. Because you have the reptilians and you got the grays, and now they're coming out that they look more browner than they are gray, depending on what part of the world you're at. So a lot of this could be false information on how they actually look, or maybe they personify themselves to certain specific people, like this is what they want to see, so I want to show them this.
Could be.
Well, that's what's interesting about this case. This was a judge. He had been a judge and a congressman. Let's see. He was a U.S. senator from Arkansas, a district court judge in Texarkana, and a circuit judge. And so this guy was well known in the area. And he had seen, many people had seen this UFO, but he was, his account, they interviewed him, and he said he had seen this ship within 300 feet of the ground, and that he could hear the passengers talking loudly. It doesn't specify what language that people heard. But he said, in this case, it happened a week later on April the 23rd in Texarkana. The state senator, Lawrence Byrne, he was surveying a tract of land in McKinney Bayou, and he came across an unbelievable sight. The airship landed and was anchored on the ground, and there were 3 humanoids in or around the ship. He described the occupants as looking Asian, and they were talking to each other. He said they were probably talking Japanese. So he doesn't describe them as bearded guys. They're not naked giants. They're not Nordic with beautiful blonde hair. But he described them as looking Asian and speaking what he thought was possibly Japanese. Says he was the newspaper says he's an exceptional eyewitness who would have no cause to invent an airship story. And so, again, because he was a prominent figure in the community, they said, you got to trust this guy. I mean, why would a judge and a senator come out? Well, we saw President Carter talking about seeing a UFO. Well, this guy had seen some humanoids, and he thought that they were Asian.
Anchored down sounds like it was tied down, right?
Right, it sounded like it was anchored. And one of the stories talks about a guy who went out to look at talking about anchor, and he said that they lowered down, from the spaceship, they lowered down a hook, and he began running, and it grabbed him and lifted him up into the air, and he was shouting and cursing at them and stuff, and then they dropped him, and he landed in the mud. So then he didn't know if they were actually trying to anchor the ship and stop, or if they were actually trying to catch him and bring him up into the spaceship.
Steve, I want to interject that one story, which is not in this book. In the 1800s, an airship dropped a massive piece of metal into the middle of this Midwestern town. I forget now, Ohio or somewhere. And this humongous piece of metal that looked sort of like an anchor fell right in the middle of town from up in the passing airship. And so the people made a monument of it. They put it in the middle of town. They built a little platform for it. People came from miles around to look at it. And over the course of time, it went missing. Nobody knows when. So,
yeah, there's another description of these guys they actually took out their guns and started shooting at the UFO, their Winchesters or something, and the UFO threw rocks at them, big, huge rocks, and the guys ran. The next day they gathered them up, and it said they didn't know what kind of material these rocks were made of, so they took them into town to have them analyzed. And it says people came from all around to look at these rocks. Now, what happened to them, I don't know, but that was recorded in the paper that they had these big rocks thrown at them from the airship, and that the next day they picked them up and took them to town, to the sheriff's office or whatever. But they had been shooting at the H. Well, what do you think is going to happen? So those were the stories that I was just going to cover today. There's many stories that happened prior to 1896 in here, and there are several that happened in the early 1900s. I just wanted to cover these ones that all happened within a two-week time span, which were seen and reported by thousands of people in newspapers across the Midwest. Again, the places started in California and up and down the West Coast, but after that it moved to the Midwest. Wisconsin, Missouri, Michigan, Indiana, a lot in Michigan, Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. So they all kind of happened in the Midwest during this same time period. Like I say, 13 sightings in 12 days reported in the book, and that they were all interviewed credible witnesses that described what they had seen. So it was very good reporting from the newspapers and the descriptions that they gave at the time. And so I thought, how many sightings have gone on where people didn't report them, that the newspapers didn't talk about them? Even like today, people see stuff and they don't want to say. Well, the guy said they interviewed all these government guys and only 2 out of 96 or something wanted to give their names that they had, because they wanted to remain anonymous because they were afraid they might lose their jobs or something like that. So these were just the ones I wanted to talk about. And of course, Noe says he's out of these books, so if you want to read more about them, I guess you'll have to wait until the next book fair we have or whatever, that you could get a copy. Or you could go on to RoswellBooks.com and look at all the different stories. Like I said before, I've been reading a lot of his stories and have gotten a lot of ideas for I want to write a children's book, so I'm retired now. I got plenty of time, so I'm hoping that I could sit down and take some of the ideas that I've gotten from these stories. And one of my favorites was when the guys climbed up into the tree and hid for 2 days from the aliens and then came down. I thought that could be a good start to the story, where some kids hide up in the trees and then run home to tell their parents, and the parents don't believe them. I don't believe that. What were you doing out in the woods or whatever? So,
I have a question.
Yes.
You want the children's book you want to write, is it about UFOs and aliens, like targeted at children?
well, I'm going to try to start based on real things that happen, but make it a historical fiction type book. So I want to try to start where these kids kind of become teenage MUFON members or something like that, where they're going to go out and investigate
The Hardy Boys.
things that people have told them. So
That's a good idea.
they want to go out and kind of be detectives. I mean, that's just my idea of what
Okay.
the story I want to
I'm
write
glad you
about.
said that, because I have been thinking something similar, and
There's your co-author.
past few days, honestly.
Oh, really?
But towards children, like younger
Oh,
children,
yeah.
to start having stories, like read aloud, picture books, for targeted at younger, like elementary.
Now, I know there are a few, because when I was
wondering.
I used to read one called Alistair in Outer Space, which was about a little alien. Of course, that was years and years ago that I read that, so I don't know if anything's come out since then. But that's just, my wife keeps saying, what are you waiting for? Get busy, get to work.
On that note, I think we need to get together, because we're actually invited, the Recreation Union members, they want to present similar for younger crowd.
Oh, okay.
So I guess let's get together and we'll collaborate.
Well, some of the stories I tell, I could just change the characters to be aliens instead of humans or something.
What is your target age going to be?
Well, I thought maybe like 4th, 5th, and middle school age for like a chapter books.
Yeah.
Because working at the library with Noe, I don't see the high school kids reading that much. But the little kids, they're still excited about reading. Today all the kids are on Google Classroom, or the teacher has, where they publish all their lessons and things online. So the kids are all every kid at McAllen High School has a laptop. And so they take it to school and they do all this stuff in the classroom on laptops. They do all their testing on laptops and things like that. So trying to get them hooked on books. Noe has several literacy fairs during the year. But believe it or not, a lot of the people that come are little kids. It's at the high school, but a lot of the kids that come are the littler kids. So.
Okay, I have a comment about when everyone was discussing how the UFOs maybe are appearing as to something that we can relate to. That reminded me of when the Virgen de Guadalupe appeared, and apparently it was the first time that it was Morenita, so that the population, the indigenous population in Mexico could relate and accept Christianity. So it reminded me of that. And then also when you were talking about the Nordic looking and the bearded aliens, and back to the Aztecs, how they based their like prophecies and stuff that, their God was bearded, white, etc., and that they said we will return. So then once the Spanish came, but on a ship, on the coast, they were bearded, they were whiter, lighter skin, so they said, oh, so these are the gods that are coming back, like based on that. So it reminded me of those two things.
That's good comments. I don't know if any more questions, not just for me, but any general questions anyone has or statement, anybody want to talk about anything? I'm pretty much done with my presentation. No,
I just wanted to say that John and I really enjoyed putting this book together. We've done 12 books about UFO cases prior to 1900. Why the emphasis on that time period? Because there was nothing flying in the sky other than birds at that time. You saw something weird in the sky, it was probably something out of the ordinary, with the exception of a few balloons that were starting to, but mostly hot air balloons which were not capable of independent steering through the air and going fast speed. So we liked this time period because it was before aircraft, it was before anything was up in the air, and we found hundreds, as you can tell, these were just a few stories, but we found hundreds of documented cases where we have publications supporting what happened, multiple newspaper accounts of the same thing. We have eyewitness testimony from law enforcement officials and military from the 1800s, once again before 1900, when these cases were happening. The people just didn't know how to describe them. They didn't know what to call them. They'd strain. There were no science fiction at that time. So they strained their vocabulary and their thinking to try to describe what they saw. And they would use terminology which is very unfamiliar to us because they didn't know about rockets, spacecraft, none of that. They were just trying to describe it in naturalistic terms. Like there was a metallic looking beast in the sky. Well, beast, they didn't have the vocabulary that we have. So we had to, when we put these cases together, we had to look through newspaper accounts that use vocabulary other than what we're familiar with. It took a lot of investigative work because sometimes what they were describing didn't sound like a UFO. But then when you look at the whole big picture of what happened on that day, you realize that was a UFO sighting. It had all the earmarks of what today we call a UFO sighting, UAP sighting. So anyway, it was a fun book, and it's been one of our most popular sellers. It came out in November on Amazon, and I can't keep any copies on hand, and we've been selling a ton on Amazon. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a little background on the book.
Thank you, Noe, for that information. Appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Okay, again,
Ellos saben, los de ellos,